The best band in Australia, AC/DC, has been around for even longer than 60 minutes. But after more than 40 years, old age and sickness finally seem to have stopped them. You're about to dive into one of rock's most explosive discoveries. Are you ready? Angus Young, the famous guitarist for the band AC/DC, has finally thought about Eddie Van Halen and what EVH thought of AC/DC. Also, guess what? Even more than you'd think, these two giants really admire each other. This isn't just another rock story, it's the best way to get inside the Brotherhood of Legends. Don't miss this trip through the past of rock that will make you want more. The rise of two guitar icons, Eddie Van Halen and Angus Young. Angus Young of AC/DC and Eddie Van Halen are two guitarists who will always be remembered as some of the most important in rock history. Of Van Halen. These two guitar geniuses, who were born on opposite sides of the world, would go on to push the limits of hard rock guitar playing and solidify their place as true stars of the style. From a very young age, Angus showed that he loved and was good at playing the electric guitar. Angus was already playing with a fiery, jazzy style that was very skilled and interesting to watch while other kids were still learning the basics. One thing that made Angus stand out as a performer was the way he wore a schoolgirl uniform and walked around the stage like a duck. He was a force to be reckoned with on stage because he could play riffs and solos very quickly and put on a very exciting show. At the same time, Eddie Van Halen was becoming a guitar hero on the other side of the Pacific. Eddie came into the world in 1955 in the Netherlands. He and his family later moved to Pasadena, California, where he met the other people who would become in the band Van Halen. Eddie was naturally very good at playing the guitar from the very first time he picked it up. How the guitar was played in hard rock changed forever because of how fast he could tap his fingers and how he could mix different types of music. Eddie's new ideas on the electric guitar, like using the whammy bar and making his own brown sound, pushed the limits of what was possible. His fiery solos and creative guitar work made Van Halen's sound unique, captivating audiences and inspiring a huge number of other artists. Finally, after all these years, Angus is telling the truth about Eddie. Most people didn't expect it. The really interesting part is what Eddie Van Halen said about AC/DC, which might surprise you. Was it respect or anger, admiration or competition? I promise that the most shocking part will come at the end, but don't tell anyone else. Everything you thought you knew about these two rock stars will be turned on its head. Both musicians became famous, but their styles and ways of making music were very different. Angus Young's playing was known for its raw energy, direct rock and roll style, and famous antics on stage. It became a trademark of AC/DC's live shows that he could give strong performances while running around like a crazy schoolboy. On the other hand, Eddie Van Halen was known for being technically innovative and virtuosic. He made techniques like tapping with both hands very famous and added a new level of difficulty to playing rock guitar. A lot of the time, his style had classical music parts and pushed the limits of what people thought the instrument could do. Even though they were different, both guitars had a huge effect on rock music. Angus Young's high-energy, riff-driven style helped shape the sound of hard rock, and Eddie Van Halen's technical innovations encouraged a whole generation of guitarists to find new ways to play the guitar. The difference in how they did things was also clear in their live shows. Angus was known for having a lot of energy on stage and would often do the duck walk while playing difficult parts. Eddie was also a dynamic performer, but during his solos he was more interested in pushing the limits of guitar skill. Fans and reviewers would sometimes compare the two guitarists, but they always respected each other's skills. Their unique rock music styles and talents meant that each would leave an indelible mark on the genre, inspiring guitarists and music fans for years to come. The competition, the love, and the truth. Angus Young has finally told Eddie Van Halen how he really feels about him, but what Eddie thought of AC/DC will surprise you even more. Did Eddie think Angus was also really good at guitar, or was he thinking something else? This story is about a lot more than meets the eye, and we're about to find out everything. Don't be sure you know the answer. Stay until the end, because their rock and roll relationship will take some crazy turns that you won't believe. Van Halen, First Encounters, and AC/DC all meet. One of the first times that AC/DC and Van Halen met was at the Day on the Green Festival in Oakland, California on July 23, 1978. Both bands played before Aerosmith at this event, which was put together by Bill Graham. It was an important time for both bands, but especially for Van Halen, who were on their first tour. These up-and-coming artists could show off their skills to a huge crowd of 60,000 people at the event. The shows were going to be epic, and the crowd was going to love it. Eddie Van Halen's amazing guitar skills and David Lee Roth's captivating stage personality really got the party started for Van Halen. Then it was AC/DC's turn. The Aussie band was just as intense as Van Halen, with the charismatic Bon Scott on vocals and the famous Angus Young on guitar. Their rough blues-influenced sound and high-energy show made everyone go crazy. The show by AC/DC had a huge effect. When Eddie Van Halen saw AC/DC play, he was amazed by how powerful and energetic they were. Afterward, he remembered that AC/DC was most likely one of the strongest live bands he had ever seen. They couldn't be stopped by the energy. Eddie was most pleased by Bon Scott singing in Angus Young's famous songs Wind Me Up and Let Me Go Dance. Angus Young, in turn, saw Eddie Van Halen play the guitar for the first time. Young said it was like hearing Jimi Hendrix for the first time when Eddie came along. He was a real innovator. Just like Jimi Hendrix, the guitarist for AC/DC, was blown away by Eddie's new ideas, especially his performance of Eruption, which made an impact that will last. Even though both bands were on the same bill that day, they didn't meet for the first time until many years later. In 1984, it happened at the Monsters of Rock Festival at Donington, where AC/DC and Van Halen met for real. Eddie went to AC/DC's trailer after Van Halen's set, where he was filled with excitement and respect for Angus Young's playing. Angus remembered the event very clearly. Eddie walks in and says, "Hey you know what? What a bad, crazy player you are, Eddie," who Angus thought was a guitar genius. Gave the AC/DC guitarist a praise that he didn't expect. It shocked him. The first meeting between the two bands set the stage for a long-lasting friendship. Eddie Van Halen really liked hanging out with Malcolm Young, and the two of them would often share drinks at the bar after shows. Besides that, he liked hanging out with Brian Johnson and playing darts with him. Over the years, both guitarists grew to respect each other more. Billboard magazine asked Eddie Van Halen about his favorite guitarists, and Angus Young was one of them. Angus Young always praised Eddie's creative way of playing the guitar, showing that the respect went both ways. Throughout their lives, they kept running into each other. Angus Young said that Eddie and he had last seen each other in 2008 when Eddie came to see a AC/DC's Black Ice show in Los Angeles. Even back then, Eddie's friendly personality and contagious smile made an impact on Angus that would last. Eddie was interested in another Powerage song called Riff Raff. In an interview with Eddie in 2015, I said that Riff Raff was one of my favorite AC/DC songs of all time. He talked about how much he liked these songs by saying, "Just the power, the sheer, it just engulfs you. You can feel it. It makes your body shake." The guitar skills of both Angus and Malcolm Young were very good in Eddie Van Halen's eyes. Eddie and Malcolm had a very strong bond with each other. He made it a point to go to AC/DC shows in California so that they could spend time together. If you remember, Angus Young said that Eddie and Malcolm were very close. From the first time they met, Eddie's respect for Angus Young's playing was clear. Eddie has been amazed by AC/DC's energy and Angus's famous stage appearance ever since he saw them play at the Day on the Green Festival in 1978. AC/DC made a big difference in Eddie Van Halen's singing career. Eddie often talked about how the strong live shows by AC/DC had an effect on him. When Eddie saw AC/DC play at the Day on the Green event, he wondered if his own band could top such a powerful show. Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's son, told Classic Rock in an interview in 2022 that the Powerage record was how his father first heard AC/DC, teaching younger people how much he loves the band's songs. Eddie Van Halen and AC/DC respected each other, and when Malcolm Young died in November 2017, they paid honor to him with deep sadness. Eddie told everyone how sad he was by saying, "It's a sad day in rock and roll. He was the heart and soul of AC/DC and a friend of mine. On our 1984 tour of Europe, I had some of the best times of my life with him. I'm sorry for your loss. My thoughts are with his family, co-workers, and friends." Eddie Van Halen and AC/DC had a lot of respect for each other, which affected not only their music but also their friendship, which went beyond their acts on stage. These two guitar gods, Angus Young and Eddie Van Halen, are some of the best in rock history. What did Angus really think about Eddie's famous cutting, though? And how did Eddie feel about the sound of AC/DC? You're about to learn the statements that have been hidden for decades. Did Angus see Eddie as a rival, or was there something more going on? You can finally read the whole story, but you'll have to wait because we're still not done. Watch until the end to hear what Eddie had to say about Angus. Trust me, that's when the best parts start. Angus Young on Eddie's creative ways of playing the guitar. Eddie Van Halen's guitar skills were first shown to Angus Young on TV in the form of video clips, especially the groundbreaking performance of Eruption. The effect happened right away and was very strong. For Angus, it reminded him of the first time he heard Jimi Hendrix play. He was amazed and speechless at how brilliant the musician was. The drummer for AC/DC didn't know where this guy came from. It's not possible. He's not from this world. Eddie Van Halen's way of playing the guitar was unique for a number of reasons. Even though he didn't come up with the two-handed tapping method himself, he changed the way it was used and made a rock revolution. This method made it possible for fast melodic lines and complicated leads that other musicians copied but never really got right. Eddie's style wasn't just fast playing. He focused on making tunes and playing whatever sounds good, He used a lot of different techniques, such as creatively using the whammy bar for wide pitch bends and dive bombs, mixing natural and artificial harmonics in new ways, playing with complex rhythms and syncopation, and making catchy riffs that mixed heavy distortion with melodic elements. Eddie's work on the rhythm guitar was just as creative but not as well known. He didn't use a lot of power chords. Instead, he built songs around chords. His rhythm style had a natural groove with a small swing that gave Van Halen's sound more depth. Even though Angus Young knew Eddie Van Halen was good, he liked a different way of playing the guitar. Angus told Guitar World, "Malcolm's still a better guitarist than Eddie Van Halen, even though he lets me take all the lead breaks. Van Halen is very good at playing the scales. It's not fun for me to listen to musicians who play all the notes they know in one song, though." For Angus, a more basic rock and roll style was preferred. Angus even said that Van Halen was more of a pop band in an interview at Donington in 1984, while AC/DC was called a rock and roll band. Even though they were compared, the two musicians always respected each other, having personal ties. Many stories in the world of rock and roll are about bands competing with each other, but sometimes bands become friends and respect each other. This is the case with Van Halen and AC/DC. Even though these famous bands competed with each other on the charts and at concerts, their love of rock music and their work in the business brought them together. Angus Young and Eddie Van Halen both respected each other, but Eddie's friendship with Malcolm Young was what really stood out. Angus Young talked a lot about how close his brother Malcolm was to Eddie. This friendship went beyond their shared love of music. Eddie made it a point to see Malcolm whenever AC/DC played in California, because they could go out to a bar or somewhere after hanging out. Angus said he liked hanging out with Mal the most. This bond really showed how close rock stars are to each other, going beyond the boundaries of their own bands. Prior to his unexpected death in 1980, Bon Scott had become friendly with Van Halen's first lead singer. Both were known for having lively stage presences and charming personalities. At business events, they often ran into each other and were said to enjoy each other's company, telling stories and making jokes about life on the road. After Scott's death, Roth talked about him in interviews and said nice things about his unique voice and stage appearance. The respect between the lead singers helped the two bands get along well with each other. After Bon Scott's death, Brian Johnson joined AC/DC and quickly became friends with Van Halen's cast, especially Sammy Hagar, who took over for David Lee Roth in 1985. The two musicians, Johnson and Hagar, came from working-class homes and brought a bluesy sound to their bands. In the press, the two singers often said nice things about each other, and they sometimes appeared together at charity events. Even when both bands changed their lineups, their friendship helped keep the good relationship between AC/DC and Van Halen. The bond between AC/DC and Van Halen grew stronger during the co-headlining tour they did together in 1983. Eddie Van Halen often talked about this event, saying, "We had a great time on a co-headlining tour with them back in 1983 or 1984. The bands had a lot of chances to talk to each other and share their stories on this tour. Both bands went on a lot of tours over the years, so they often played at the same festivals or in the same places. Backstage talks and parties after shows gave members of both bands a chance to hang out without being seen by the public. Getting together informally like this helped the band members get closer. They would talk about music, share stories from the road, and sometimes jam together on the spot. Even though these events were rarely recorded, they were very important in making the friendship between AC/DC and Van Halen stronger. The band members were close enough to each other that they helped each other through hard times. Malcolm Young of AC/DC had to quit because of health problems, and the Van Halen camp sent him words of support. Similarly, when Eddie Van Halen was having health issues, members of AC/DC openly showed their support and wished him well. What happens when two of rock's biggest guitar stars get together? Angus Young is about to finally tell you what he really thought of Eddie. What did Eddie think of AC/DC, though? There might have been a little of both, or maybe there was respect. We're about to tell you a story about their friendship that has never been told before. The truth will shock you. Stay until the end. People will tell you things that will blow your mind. Respecting each other and recognizing each other's skills. The story about Eddie Van Halen calling Angus Young at 2 a.m. shows how much love and friendship there was between two of rock's best guitarists. This story shows not only how much they respect each other, but also how much they want to make music more interesting. Eddie Van Halen and Angus Young were both at the top of their games in the early 1980s. When Angus Young was on tour to promote the band's album For Those About to Rock, We Salute You, Eddie Van Halen worked on new music at home in Los Angeles. It was around 2 a.m., one night when Eddie had a guitar riff thought that he just couldn't shake. His mind was full of ideas, and he thought that Angus's feedback could be just what he needed to make his idea come to life. Eddie chose to get in touch with Angus. This call wasn't just a chat. Eddie did this because he respected Angus's artistic skill and thought it was important for people to work together. After calling Angus's hotel room, Eddie started a lively chat about playing the guitar as soon as Angus picked up the phone. He had been working on this new method and was excited to show it to someone who could understand how complicated it was. Eddie started to play the riff on his guitar into the phone speaker to show how to do it. Even though Angus was woken up in the middle of the night, he didn't seem annoyed. He instead paid close attention as Eddie played. When Eddie was done with his impromptu show, Angus said, "Yeah, that's great," Eddie in his usual quiet way. Even though this answer seemed short, it was typical of Angus's straightforward nature. It wasn't a lack of interest, it was a quick compliment from one guitar genius to the next. Even though Eddie was playing in a strange place, Angus could tell that he was skilled and creative. But that's not the end of the story. Eddie then asked Angus to play something for him in return. He may have been excited or just wanted to keep the music going. But Angus, being as sensible as ever, pointed out that it was late and said no, suggesting that they could play together another time. Angus's readiness to take a call late at night showed that he respected Eddie and was willing to work with him on a creative project. This meeting was more than just an exchange of thoughts for both musicians. It was a show of how much they respected each other and how dedicated they were to pushing the limits of their art. Since then, rock fans have loved telling this story as a way to show how much respect and friendship can exist between artists. You can see from this that even the most famous musicians are pushed by their love of music and want to help and inspire each other no matter what. How two rock giants changed the world. Angus Young is one of the most famous rock stars because he was the lead guitarist for AC/DC and helped to start the band. His trademark schoolboy outfit, along with his high-energy shows and blazing guitar riffs, made him a symbol of rock's rebellious spirit. His stage appearance is important, but it's the way he plays that has stuck with people. His guitar style is based on blues rock, and some of AC/DC's most famous songs, like Back in Black, Highway to Hell, and Thunderstruck, are built around simple but powerful riffs that Young plays. Young is unique because he can strip rock down to its most basic parts: energy, rhythm, and raw feeling. His riffs aren't very complicated, but they are memorable and easy to spot. He has inspired generations of guitarists to keep things simple without sacrificing effect. Many hard rock and metal bands that came after Angus Young sound like they were influenced by him. His skill at combining bluesy grit with heavy power chords is setting a standard for guitarists to follow. Eddie Van Halen, on the other hand, changed the way people play the guitar technically. As the lead guitarist for Van Halen, he came up with ways to play the guitar that will never be the same again. His use of tapping, which is a way to play notes by tapping the guitar with both hands, on songs like Eruption shocked the music world and raised the bar for skill. Van Halen kept coming up with new ideas after that. His Frankenstrat guitar, which was made by putting together different guitar parts to make a new sound, also pushed the limits of tone and sound. Van Halen had an effect on more than just skill. A lot of guitarists were moved by him to play around with their sound gear and ideas. He was good at both technical and melodic playing. He mixed difficult riffs with catchy hooks that made Van Halen one of the most popular rock bands ever. His playing paved the way for the proficient shredding style that was popular in the 1980s and had an impact on styles like glam metal and progressive rock. The famous guitarist from Guns N' Roses, Slash, has talked freely about how much Angus Young and AC/DC affected him. Especially when he was young, Slash was blown away by Young's raw, high-energy shows and powerful guitar playing, which were big parts of AC/DC's sound. Slash has talked a lot about how great Angus was on stage and how other rock players should try to be like him in interviews. One thing that Slash really likes about Angus is that he can keep up a huge amount of energy during AC/DC shows. Slash said that Angus' careful and exciting performance style on stage had a big impact on how he performs live. He talked a lot about how Angus could keep up such a high level of energy as both a guitarist and a performer. The Foo Fighters' Dave Grohl has also said nice things about Angus Young. Grohl has often said that Young's raw energy and electrifying stage appearance were two things that stuck with him. He talked about Angus as an example of pure, unfiltered rock and roll and talked about how his powerful guitar playing has affected how he performs and writes songs. Jennifer Batten, who was Michael Jackson's lead guitarist on his famous shows, has often talked about how Eddie Van Halen had a huge effect on her career. Jackson's most famous song, Beat It, had a rock edge that Van Halen's guitar solo added to. Batten's own musical journey was further shaped by this solo. Batten said that the solo was the most important thing in her life because it bought me a house and launched my career. The fact that Angus Young and Eddie Van Halen are still popular shows how much of an effect they had on rock music. Both musicians were still admired years after they became famous. Their music is still very famous. Old songs are still played on the radio all the time and inspire new generations of rock fans. The legacies of Angus Young and Eddie Van Halen continue to inspire and affect musicians and fans all over the world. This means that their effect on rock music will last for generations. Did Angus Young ever quietly think Eddie Van Halen was a great guitarist? What did Eddie think of the heavy songs by AC/DC? Before now, the truth had been a secret for years. Finally, Angus spoke out, and what he said shocked everyone more than you might think. Did these two masters compete with each other on the guitar, or did they have a dark side? Also, you won't want to miss what Eddie had to say, so stay with us until the end to find out what they really think about each other. This song is Angus Young's honor to Eddie Van Halen. Eddie Van Halen, a famous guitarist and co-founder of the rock band Van Halen, died on October 6, 2020, after a long fight with cancer. He was 65 years old. He had been dealing with throat cancer in secret for years. In the early 2000s, he was also identified with tongue cancer, which he went on to beat. Even so, his health got worse in his last years, and it was said that the cancer had spread to his brain and other parts of his body. Eddie's death was a big loss for the music business. Fans of Van Halen and rock music in general had been following his career since the band's explosive launch in the late 1970s. Their deaths marked the end of an era. Eddie Van Halen's son Wolfgang Van Halen, who played bass in the band, revealed the death of his father in a touching post on social media. He said that Eddie was the best father he could have ever asked for, and that every time with him, on or off stage, was a gift. Eddie's unique contributions to rock music were praised by fans, other musicians, and leaders in the business. Eddie Van Halen's death not only took away one of the best guitarists in rock history, but it also ended a band that had made a big difference in the genre. Angus Young, the famous guitarist for the band AC/DC, talked about Eddie Van Halen's death and said that it leaves a big hole in the music world. Young and many other people in the music business were devastated when they heard that Van Halen's cancer had come back. Young said, "When you hear the news that the cancer has come back, you really hope and pray that the guy gets through it." The guitarist kept talking about how sad it was that Van Halen had died, both for the music world and for people who knew him personally. Young had happy memories of the times he met Van Halen and talked about how friendly and excited they were to be together. He talked about how Van Halen was such a nice person when they met for the first time in the 1990s while on tour in Europe. With a huge grin, laugh, and hug, this first opinion stayed with them through all of their meetings. The drummer for AC/DC also talked about a more recent meeting that happened during their Black Ice tour in the United States. Van Halen came to their Los Angeles shows, and Young said that he was still the same. He was so happy to see us and had a big smile on his face. Young talked about how much Van Halen loved his late brother Malcolm Young, who was the rhythm guitarist for the band AC/DC. This showed how close the two artists were. He said, "It is a sad day in rock and roll when Malcolm Young died in November 2017. Eddie Van Halen agreed. He was the heart and soul of AC/DC and a friend of mine. On our 1984 tour of Europe, I had some of the best times of my life with him." In his thoughts on Eddie Van Halen's death, Angus Young said the same thing, which shows how close people in the rock music world are to each other. This is the end of the movie. Thanks for seeing. If you like this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to get more. Click on the movie that comes up next to read more exciting stories.